The story of Dracula left the page a long time ago. It stepped outside quietly without asking permission, without carrying the name of its author. It moved through the stage, through cinema, through retellings, in which the teller no longer remembered what was being retold. At some point, it stopped being a work. It existed as something familiar recognized, even when no one mentioned where it came from. What matters is that this moment made no sound. There was no clear marker to indicate when the story stopped belonging to the person who wrote it. There were no records, no declarations, no formal transfer. It simply happened the way a habit forms or a belief spreads once people grow accustomed to its presence to the point that they no longer question it. When a story begins to live a life of its own attention, usually turns back to the story itself. People analyze its imagery, dissect its symbols, trace its cultural origins. What is rarely done is looking further back to the time before everything slipped beyond control. Rarely does anyone ask about the person standing at the starting point, when the story had not yet taken on a finished shape, when it was still a loose sequence of thoughts, not yet strong enough to escape its original intention. Before Dracula became a familiar name, Bram Stoker was not a figure of notice. He did not enter cultural life as a controversial presence, nor was he regarded as someone driven by the ambition to shape the obsessions of an era. He lived within steady rhythms of work-functional relationships and a life that from the outside was difficult to call remarkable. There is a familiar tendency, when looking back at history, to assign great intentions to great outcomes. People want to believe that lasting impact must originate from extraordinary individuals, from clear ambitions, from decisions made with full awareness of their consequences. But life rarely operates that way. Large outcomes are often accumulated from small actions, repeated and considered reasonable within their circumstances. Before Dracula could exist as a symbol in its own right, there was a long period in which it was nothing at all. During that time, Bram Stoker was not acting as the creator of an immortal creature, but as a person trying to impose order on the world around him. He did not live at the margins of society, nor in opposition to his time. On the contrary, he blended into its rhythm with ease. Those years are not remembered for drama. They passed through offices, carefully arranged schedules, and the handling of details others preferred not to notice. It was a life shaped by organization responsibility and the assurance that things functioned as expected. In that world, emotion was not central. Consistency was. There is a particular comfort in knowing that things can be arranged. That disorder can be pushed to the edges. That which is difficult to understand can at least temporarily be set aside. For many people, this is the only way life remains manageable. For Bram Stoker, it does not appear to have been an unusual choice, but a reflex formed early on. Looking back from the present, it is easy to read signs in reverse, to search every detail of his life for a prediction of what would come later. But at the time, there was no warning, no sense of approaching danger, no intuition that a boundary was about to be crossed. Everything remained within what felt acceptable. That is what makes the question more unsettling. If there were no clear signs, no conscious intent, then what truly happened? How did a sequence of reasonable choices made in ordinary circumstances lead to an outcome far beyond the control of the person who made them? Perhaps the better question is not what Dracula became, but who Bram Stoker was during the period when the story remained in his hands. Not as a writer, but as a person living, working, believing that what he was doing was necessary, justified, or at least harmless. Before the story separated itself from the teller, there was a person who believed in record keeping and systemization, in the ability to turn what was vague into something that could be understood. And it was precisely there, when understanding became the highest priority, that the story began to shift away from its original position, not through a sudden leap, but through a series of small movements almost impossible to detect. These movements did not look dangerous. They took the shape of diligence, responsibility, and the desire for clarity. And by the time it became apparent that something had changed, the story was no longer standing still long enough to be called back. At that moment, before Dracula could live a life of its own, Bram Stoker was still only a person who believed the world would be safer if it were placed in order. And perhaps that belief, more than anything else, was the true beginning of everything that followed. There are periods in a human life that are not marked by events, but by their absence. They are remembered not for what happened, but for what could not happen over a span of time long enough to alter the way a person exists. For Bram Stoker, that period began very early, when his body became a closed space and the world outside continued to function without requiring his participation. For 7 consecutive years, he lay still, not unconscious, not submerged in darkness, but awake in the way a child is forced to observe rather than act. His body would not allow him to step into the world, yet his awareness continued to receive it. The world did not disappear. It simply changed the way it appeared. Those days followed no clear progression. Time was not measured by movement or transformation, but by repetition. The ceiling, light slipping through a window, footsteps moving through the house, voices from the next room, sometimes whispers, sometimes laughter held back. Everything reached him in fragments, incomplete without full context. The world as imagined by a child, confined to a bed, was not a flow. It resembled a fixed picture, where elements changed very little, and whatever change did occur remained out of reach. People came and went, but his position did not shift. Time passed, yet left no mark on the body. In that condition, action was no longer a way to engage with life. Observation became the only option. Listening became a necessary skill. Remembering, even without paper or pencil, became a reflex. When intervention is impossible, the mind begins to arrange the world, using what it can see and hear, searching for order within stillness. The stories told in the sick room were not meant as entertainment. They were not chosen to soothe, but to fill silence. Sometimes they were family memories, sometimes past events, sometimes fragments of things adults believed a child would not fully understand. But in that state of confinement, everything arrived on equal terms. There was no clear division between what should be heard and what should not. Sound became the primary way the world entered, a voice familiar enough to identify the speaker, a silence long enough to signal something left unsaid, a sigh carrying more meaning than a complete story. When the whole cannot be seen, one learns to read the smallest signs. It was within that prolonged stillness that a quiet habit formed. The world began to be understood as a structure of fixed elements, each holding its place within a minimally shifting order. People appear as roles rather than as individuals in motion. Behavior repeated. Routine persisted. Stability, even when uncomfortable, became predictable. For a child, unable to move, that predictability offered a certain safety. When the world cannot be influenced, believing that it can be understood and anticipated becomes a way to survive. What does not change feels more reliable than what might vanish without warning. The body during those 7 years was not a vehicle for experience, but a boundary. It set limits on every possibility. And when someone lives long enough within a fixed boundary, their thinking begins to adjust to it. They learn to exist inside the limit rather than constantly resist it. Nothing in this period resembled a decisive moment. There were no major choices, no memorable actions. Yet it was precisely the absence of action that left the deepest mark. When a person learns how to exist without the ability to act, they begin to believe that understanding and arranging the world in the mind is enough. That habit did not vanish when the body recovered. It was not erased by the return of movement. It followed quietly, becoming a way of seeing life, a belief that the world, however complex, could still be placed into fixed frames. That chaos could be softened if observed long enough and arranged correctly. And perhaps it was from those years of being enclosed that a question formed without needing to be spoken. If a person can exist through observation and understanding, alone is action truly necessary? And if action is not required, what happens when someone carrying that habit steps into a wider world where fixed frames no longer remain as still as they once did? The earliest memories do not always come from direct experience. Some are passed down, not through clear images, but through voices' repetition and the manner of the teller when they speak of them. For Bram Stoker, a significant part of what he knew about the world did not come from witnessing it, but from listening. And during the years when he was confined within his own body, listening was not merely an option. It was the only path through which the world could enter. His mother did not tell stories to comfort, nor did she tell them to entertain. The stories she brought were things she had witnessed herself or heard repeated within a community that had lived through collective panic. Cholera did not appear in her telling as a distant catastrophe, but as a reality that had touched every house and every person. It was recounted without climax, without drama, and it was precisely that calmness that made it heavier. Certain details were repeated again and again. Streets emptied of people, houses sealed shut, bodies are buried without proper rites, and cases in which no one was certain whether the person placed in the coffin had truly died, not because of ignorance, but because fear moved faster than verification. When illness spread more quickly, then certainty communities were forced to act before answers could be confirmed. These stories were not told with the intention of frightening a child. They were told as a way of remembering, as a reminder that there had been times when social order was so fragile that a single epidemic was enough to bring it down. His mother recounted what she knew, not to create an obsession, but to prevent forgetting from happening too easily. In the room where Bram Stoker lay motionless, those memories had nowhere to go. They could not be pushed aside by play or distraction. They stayed settled and gradually became part of the mental landscape. When personal experience cannot confirm or deny them, a child learns to accept collective memory as an obvious truth. What distinguished these memories was that they belonged to no single individual. They had no clear owner. They were held by a community passed from one person to another, preserved not because they were engaging, but because they were considered necessary. And when an individual absorbs such memories early enough and long enough, the boundary between what was lived and what was heard begins to blur. In the stories of cholera, what frightened was not only the disease, but the way people responded to it. Panic made extreme actions seem reasonable. Exhuming graves to check was not seen as a violation, but as a necessity. Acting on suspicion, rather than certainty, was accepted as a precaution. Choices were made not out of malice, but because no other options appeared available. A child listening to these accounts has no distance from which to analyze them. They are not placed within historical or moral frames. They are simply what happened, and their retelling quietly affirms that this is how the world behaves when pushed to its limits. There is no conclusion, no explicit lesson drawn, only the continued presence of memory as part of reality. When collective memory enters an individual, it does not carry its full original context. It brings emotion, urgency, and patterns of behavior that were once used to survive. In the mind of a child who has never left his bed, those patterns are not tested. They are accepted as pieces of the world waiting to be fitted into a larger structure later on. There is a subtle difference between fearing something and accepting it as a normal part of life. Stories of disease and premature burial were not told with hysteria. They were told about things that had happened and therefore could happen again. That normalization allowed them to take deeper root. They did not trigger flight. They cultivated a quiet vigilance. Through this process, Bram Stoker did not merely receive information, he absorbed a way of seeing, a belief that there are moments when reason is too slow, when people must act on incomplete signs. That absolute certainty is sometimes a luxury that cannot be waited for. These ideas were not taught deliberately, yet they seeped in through repetition. As these memories settled, they began to shape an understanding of responsibility. Not personal responsibility, but collective responsibility. The idea that there are actions no one wants to take, but someone must, and that doing nothing can at times be considered more dangerous than acting incorrectly. Those memories did not disappear as his body gradually recovered. They were not replaced by new experiences. They became a quiet foundation, rarely spoken of, but always present. And when a person carries collective memory like this into their own life, the question is no longer whether those memories are true, but whether one has the right to discard them. Because when a memory belongs to no single person, it is not easily forgotten. And once it has been transmitted into an individual, choosing to forget is no longer a simple personal decision. It becomes an act with consequences, not only for the one who forgets, but for everything that memory was once meant to protect. When collective memories are passed down long enough, they no longer exist as separate stories. They connect, forming a shared sense of how the world behaves when pushed to its limits. In those memories, disease is not merely the spread of illness. It is a force that dissolves boundaries once taken for granted. And when boundaries begin to blur, people are compelled to act without firm ground beneath them. During times of epidemic, the first thing to disappear is not life, but distinction. Living and dead cease to be clearly separate states. Some bodies still breathe, yet do not respond. There are people declared dead who later move again. When medical knowledge is insufficient to deliver certainty, communities fall back on fragile signs, rapid judgments, and rituals carried forward from the past. This uncertainty does not unfold quietly. It settles over daily life, making every decision heavier. When no one can be sure, waiting for clear answers becomes a risk in itself. In such conditions, action is no longer judged by accuracy but by speed. Acting early is considered safer than acting correctly. A community facing a widespread threat does not behave as a collection of independent individuals. It acts as a single body, responding through instinctive self-protection. Decisions are made without prolonged debate. They are accepted because no one wishes to bear responsibility for the delay. In that atmosphere, actions that would normally be unthinkable begin to resemble necessity. Digging up graves to check is no longer seen as a violation. Employing drastic measures to stop what is uncertain is no longer questioned. Moral boundaries constructed in times of calm become flexible. They bend to match the urgency of the situation. And once everyone accepts that bending it gradually comes to seem reasonable, what is striking is that fear in these moments does not exist as a chaotic emotion. It is organized. It is explained. It is placed within a framework that convinces people they are acting correctly. Fear ceases to be a personal reflex and becomes part of collective reasoning. People do not say they are afraid. They say they must act to protect others. When fear is expressed in the language of responsibility, it becomes legitimized. Actions born of anxiety are transformed into duties. Doing nothing becomes a suspect choice. Anyone who questions the necessity of action is viewed as failing to understand the severity of the danger. In such a space, doubt is no longer a virtue. It becomes a potential threat. The community gradually forms its own logic, where any action can be justified if it is tied to survival. This logic does not require full agreement. It only requires sufficiently widespread silence. And that silence arrives quickly because few wish to stand apart from a decision believed to protect the many. In this state, the line between prevention and harm becomes difficult to see. Acts performed with the intention of stopping evil can themselves become sources of damage. But in chaos, the ability to judge long-term consequence diminishes. What matters most is the feeling of having done something rather than remaining still in helplessness. Memories of these periods are not preserved as clear moral lessons. They persist as an uncomfortable truth about how humans respond when cornered. Under certain conditions, extreme actions do not require malice to occur. They need only a context where certainty vanishes and time is compressed. For a child, receiving these stories at a distance through retelling what is learned is not the detail of each act, but its structure. An order within chaos, where fear does not erupt randomly, but is guided, explained, and used as a tool for decision making. Once these structures are remembered, they become templates for understanding collective behavior. They suggest that there are moments when right and wrong cannot be determined by ordinary principles. That correctness may be a product of circumstance rather than fixed standards. And when this belief takes hold, questions of individual responsibility begin to blur. Within collective memory, no single person bears responsibility for decisions made during epidemics. Responsibility is dispersed, dissolved into the group. This offers relief, but it also leaves a void, because when no one is the final decision maker, no one is the final bearer of responsibility. And it is within that void that a quiet question persists, unanswered, even after everything has passed. In chaos, when boundaries dissolve and action is driven by urgency, who is the one with the right to decide what is right? Bram Stoker's recovery did not arrive as an event that could be recorded with a precise date. It did not take the shape of a dramatic turning point, nor was it preceded by any clear sign. It unfolded slowly, almost quietly enough for those around him to accept it as something that had already happened rather than something still happening. His body, long accustomed to stillness, began to show responses that no one had dared to expect. At first, they were small movements, ambiguous signs that made it difficult to decide how much trust to place in them. A tightening of the hand, a delayed reflex, a shift in breathing. These signs were not strong enough to confirm anything, yet not weak enough to dismiss. They existed in a gray space where hope and doubt moved together. For the 7 years before that, Bram Stoker's body had been regarded as unchanging. It was a stable fact, an accepted limit. And when that limit began to move, no one knew how to respond. There was a suspended interval in which people both anticipated recovery and feared that their anticipation would be betrayed. Full recovery, when it truly came, did not carry a sense of victory. It did not erase the years that had passed, nor did it return everything to its original state. Instead, it placed Bram Stoker in a new position, one in which he had to learn how to live with a body he had once believed incapable of functioning. Standing, moving, and re-entering ordinary life was not a simple return. It was a reconfiguration. Some people emerge from illness with the feeling that life has been given back to them. Others return with the sense that they have crossed a threshold where concepts once considered solid no longer hold. For Bram Stoker, recovery was not only a physical change, it was an experience of crossing a personal boundary, a direct encounter with a state usually mentioned only in reference to death. The condition before recovery was not death in the absolute sense, yet it was close enough to make that boundary unclear. During that time, he existed in an intermediate zone where life could not be affirmed through action and death could not be confirmed through complete absence. The experience carried no dramatic images and no supernatural sensations. It was simply a prolonged presence in waiting. When someone steps out of such a state, the question is not whether they still fear death. The question is whether they can still believe the boundary between life and death is absolute. Bram Stoker had lived long enough in that blurred zone to understand that familiar classifications might not fully reflect reality. Life and death, in his experience, were not two separate opposites, but points along a continuous spectrum. Returning to ordinary life did not erase the memory of that intermediate state. It remained as a quiet reference for everything that followed. When others spoke of death as a clear ending, Bram Stoker carried a different understanding, unspoken, yet strong enough to shape how he saw the world. A recovered body restored the capacity for action, but it also carried a sense of unfamiliarity. Being present in a body that had once refused to act did not feel the same as it did for those who had never known prolonged stillness. Every movement bore traces of recollection, as though body and awareness were still negotiating control. During this period, Bram Stoker spoke little about what he had experienced. There was no urge to turn it into a story. It was not retold as a miracle or as proof of willpower. It existed as a personal reality, difficult to share, difficult to articulate, and therefore kept within. But remaining unspoken did not mean it lacked influence. Returning from a state close to death makes a person more sensitive to the gray zones of existence. It weakens faith in clear divisions. Once someone has stood very near a boundary and then crossed it, that boundary no longer carries the same meaning. It becomes something that can be questioned, something that can be crossed under certain conditions. This did not make Bram Stoker dismissive of death. On the contrary, it led him to regard it with a different kind of caution. Not fear, but the awareness that what people believe to be certain may be less stable than assumed. And when belief in absolutes is unsettled, the way one approaches the world shifts with it. The experience of return was not an entirely new beginning. It layered itself over memories and habits already formed. A child who had learned how to exist without action, who had absorbed collective memories of uncertainty, now carried an additional personal experience, confirming that boundaries, once thought firm, could be erased. When Bram Stoker stepped back into the world with a recovered body, he carried not only new abilities, but a quiet understanding that crossing a boundary does not always arrive with clear awareness of having done so, and that once a person has returned from a place they were believed unable to return from, belief in absolute divisions will never again remain intact in quite the same way. There are people who, after passing through a disruption large enough, do not seek adventure or new limits. They do not want to test how far they can go. What they look for is a solid surface to stand on, a space where things do not shift too quickly, do not demand immediate reaction, and do not force them to confront the gray zones they have already crossed. Bram Stoker entered adulthood in that way, quietly, without rupture, without signs of someone trying to compensate for years that had been taken away. He chose work with clear shapes, predefined roles, where each day could be measured by schedules and each responsibility had a definite endpoint. In that world, what mattered was not feeling, but smooth operation. The administrative and managerial path promised no glory. It demanded patience, attention to detail, and a belief that order, if maintained long enough, would produce stability on its own. For Bram Stoker, this was not resignation. It was a reasonable choice. After years of living in a body that refused to follow any plan, placing life within predictable frameworks offered balance. In his work, he found comfort in tasks that appeared ordinary, organizing papers, tracking schedules, making sure connections are aligned correctly. Each completed task was a small confirmation that the world could still function according to order. There were no gray zones on a task list. Something was either done or it was not. Record keeping became inseparable from his life, not merely a professional habit, but a way of thinking. Things written down seemed less threatening than things left to exist only in the mind. Once placed on paper, they had position limits and could be rearranged if needed. Writing did not simply preserve information, it created a sense of control. Belief in systems was not blind faith. Bram Stoker understood that no system is perfect, but he also understood that the absence of systems is more dangerous. In his memory, the most chaotic moments were always accompanied by the collapse of structure. When people no longer knew what to rely on, they began to act from urgency. And it was that urgency that led to decisions later difficult to justify. By attaching himself to order, he created distance from those memories, not to deny them, but to ensure that present life would not be governed by them. Order did not erase experience, but it placed it farther away where it no longer directly drove everyday action. Within administrative environments, responsibility is clearly divided. Each person has a role, and each decision follows a procedure. This reduces the need for personal judgment in complex situations. When a decision is made according to process, the person carrying it out can believe they have done their part. What remains belongs to the system. There is a certain relief in that way of thinking. When responsibility dissolves into procedure, personal guilt is also diminished. This is not always consciously recognized, but it creates a stable psychological ground. Bram Stoker did not need to dwell on the distant consequences of every small action. He trusted that if each part of the system performed its function, the whole would remain stable. The contrast between this ordered world and the chaotic world of his childhood was stark. On one side were decisions made in uncertainty, driven by fear and haste. On the other were slow, repeated procedures, resistant to change. In contrast, Bram Stoker chose the latter, not because it was perfect, but because it felt safest. Yet order has its own limits. It softens questions that cannot be easily answered. When everything proceeds according to procedure, no one feels compelled to stop and ask whether that procedure still fits. Stability sustained long enough can turn into complacency, but at this stage of life, those risks were not yet sharp enough to provoke concern. For Bram, Stoker order became more than a means of living. It became a way of seeing the world, a belief that uncertainty could be managed by breaking it down, recording it, and placing it into familiar frames. This belief did not deny that the boundary between life and death could blur. It simply insisted that everyday life should not be guided by that blurring. At this point, stability produced the sense that the world had returned to its proper place, that danger had been pushed beyond the boundaries of ordinary life. And when things run smoothly long enough, people begin to believe that order is not merely a choice, but a natural state. Yet precisely there, a quiet question formed, not loud enough to disrupt stability, but persistent enough to remain. Does order, for all its benefits, truly make people safer? Or does it merely make them feel at ease while deeper uncertainties continue to wait beyond sight, gathering until another moment arrives for them to return? Power does not always appear as command or coercion. Some forms of power operate in silence without threat, without the need to prove themselves. They exist in the presence of a person in the way others adjust their behavior simply to match the rhythm that person creates. Bram Stoker encountered this kind of power for a span of time, long enough for it to become familiar. 27 years working under Henry Irving were not 27 years of open conflict. It was a relationship built on admiration, dependence, and an unspoken order that required no explanation. Irving did not need to give commands to be obeyed. His presence alone was enough to orient how others acted. Within the space of theater and management, Irving's power did not come from a paper title. It came from his ability to draw attention from the way he occupied a room without raising his voice. People worked harder and more carefully, not because they feared punishment, but because they did not want to lose his recognition. It was a form of voluntary submission, sustained by fascination. Bram Stoker observed all of this from a position that was close but not central. He was not the one holding power, nor was he entirely outside it. He operated in an intermediate zone where his task was to ensure that everything ran smoothly, so that this power could continue to function without obstruction. In that role, he learned that the most effective power is power that does not need to assert itself. The submission Irving generated did not resemble oppression. It felt like a natural consensus where people believed that following was reasonable, even desirable. No one felt forced, and therefore no one felt compelled to resist. Power in this case was sustained not by fear, but by an agreement that was never questioned. Over those years, Bram Stoker witnessed how a single individual could shape the behavior of an entire group without violence or coercion. Important decisions were made in an atmosphere where direction had already been implicitly set. Other options, though they existed in theory, were rarely considered seriously, not because they were forbidden, but because they no longer fit the shared trajectory. This did not happen overnight. It was built gradually through repeated successes, through the visible benefits of compliance. Over time, power became an environmental factor, like light or temperature. It did not need to be named, yet everyone felt it. Bram Stoker did not record these observations as explicit lessons. He did not academically analyze them, but prolonged exposure allowed them to settle into his understanding of influence. He recognized that it is not always necessary to force others to act. Sometimes it is enough to create a structure in which the desired choice becomes the easiest one. This invisible power was especially effective because it left no clear trace. When people adjusted their behavior voluntarily, no moment could be identified as imposition. Responsibility blurred. Everyone participated, yet no one felt controlled. And when there is no sense of being controlled, resistance has little chance to form. In his supporting role, Bram Stoker learned how to operate within such a system. He understood that his work was not limited to paperwork or scheduling. It involved maintaining the conditions that allowed this power to continue functioning. Any disruption, any instability could weaken the fascination. Stability was therefore not just a professional requirement, but a condition for power to exist. What is notable is that throughout this long period, Bram Stoker did not see himself as part of that power. He regarded it as a phenomenon, something happening around him. But standing near a phenomenon long enough can blur the boundary between observation and participation. Without intending to, he began to absorb its operating logic. Learning how to influence without coercion was not a skill explicitly taught. It was absorbed through observing outcomes, through seeing that those who resisted the shared direction were gradually pushed aside, not by punishment, but by the absence of opportunity, and that those who aligned themselves were retained entrusted with greater responsibility and granted more trust. This observation did not make Bram Stoker cynical about power. It led him to understand that power does not need to appear frightening. It can be soft attractive and accepted as a natural part of order. And precisely because of that, it is harder to recognize. When a form of power operates so smoothly that no one questions it, it reaches its most stable state. It needs no defense and no proof. It exists through familiarity. And within that familiarity, it can shape behavior decisions and even how people understand their own roles. After 27 years, these observations settled into a quiet understanding. The most effective power is not imposed power, but power that is accepted without awareness. And when a form of power goes unnoticed, it not only influences what people do, it shapes how they think about the choices available to them. Prolonged stability carries a consequence that is rarely spoken of. It makes it difficult to notice. When everything runs smoothly, the person behind that smooth operation is seldom seen. Bram Stoker lived for many years in that state where his work was measured by the absence of problems. Everything followed the plan, and because of that, no one needed to ask who had kept the plan standing. Success in this case did not take the shape of public recognition. It existed backstage in details that remained unseen. Performances began on time. Schedules were arranged sensibly. Difficulties were resolved before they could turn into crises. All of this produced a sequence of positive outcomes, yet none of it attached itself to a specific name. Bram Stoker was not ignored crudely. He was trusted, given responsibility, and retained for the long term. But it was precisely that continuity that made his presence seem inevitable. When someone is always there and always performs correctly, they gradually blend into the setting. Their absence might attract notice, but as long as they remain, they are not seen. For many years, this did not create any obvious inner disturbance. Bram Stoker did not seek the spotlight. He was accustomed to standing near power without possessing it. Yet familiarity did not completely erase a quiet question. When success does not carry one's name, it leaves no personal trace. And without trace, existence becomes more fragile than it appears. A concern difficult to name began to form. Not fear of failure, but fear of vanishing. The thought that one day, if he were to leave everything, would continue to function as before. No one would need to adjust much. No one would need to remember. His work, designed not to depend on an individual, would simply continue on its own. That concern did not erupt into a crisis. It remained as a light sense of emptiness, slipping into rare moments of quiet. In times when no task demanded attention, Bram Stoker began to see that his life was measured more by necessity than by presence. He was necessary as long as the system required him, but not necessarily remembered. This invisibility was a direct consequence of choosing order. When everything is well organized, the individual becomes less important than the structure. That offers safety, but it also erodes personal imprint. Bram Stoker was not excluded, he was absorbed. And that absorption, though painless, carried a slow, erosive force. Some people find comfort in knowing they can be replaced. It proves that the system is stronger than the individual. Others begin to wonder what remains when their role is no longer needed. When there is no crisis to solve and no conflict to mediate, they become part of a static background. Bram Stoker did not put these thoughts into words. They did not become complaints or demands for recognition. He continued to work, continued to maintain order, and continued to remain within the safety of being needed. But through repetition, awareness of invisibility grew clearer. Invisibility does not mean being forgotten all at once. It is the condition of living without leaving a clear mark. What Bram Stoker did was not remembered as personal action, but as functions completed. And when action separates from the person who performed it, the person gradually separates from the outcome as well. In the rare moments when he had time to himself, the question did not appear as tragedy. It arrived gently, almost objectively. If one day he were no longer there, what would change? Not in a week or a month, but in the memories of others. Would anything remain attached to his name, or would everything be recalled merely as a phase that had passed? The question did not demand an immediate answer. It did not provoke hurried action, but it remained like an empty point within the structure of life. A point that does not cause collapse yet is enough to reveal the limits of stability. An order can function so well that it erases the individual. And when the individual is erased, the meaning of existence becomes harder to grasp. Bram Stoker continued to live within familiar rhythms, but with a new awareness that making everything run smoothly does not mean leaving a trace, and that the safety accompanying order sometimes comes at the cost of being seen. When a person begins to recognize their own invisibility, the question is no longer whether they are living well. The question becomes whether anything will prove they were ever there beyond the fact that the world continues to function as though they had never been. When invisibility becomes clear, the first response is not always to change the way one lives. For Bram Stoker, it manifested differently, more quietly. He did not seek attention, nor did he try to break the structures that had given him a sense of safety. Instead, he returned to a familiar space, one where presence did not need to be confirmed by the gaze of others. The library became such a place. A library does not demand swift action. It carries none of the hurried rhythm of administrative work, nor the fascination of personal power. Everything there remains still in its own way. Books wait to be opened without pressure, without judgment. Knowledge exists as a silent invitation extended to anyone willing to give time to receive it. For Bram Stoker, the library was not merely a place to gather information. It was a refuge from questions that had no clear answers in daily life. When work functioned smoothly, yet left no personal trace, knowledge offered a different form of control. Here, his presence was not dissolved. It was affirmed through the act of reading, of taking notes, of connecting ideas. Knowledge allowed the vague to be placed into order. Questions without answers no longer drifted freely. They were attached to origins, to histories, to systems of thought that had once attempted to explain them. When something is named and classified, it loses part of its unsettling power. At the very least, it becomes familiar. Bram Stoker approached knowledge not as a scholar seeking discovery. He approached it as someone who needed understanding to feel secure. The subjects that drew him were not chosen at random. They revolved around areas his memory and personal experience had already touched. Disease, death, intermediate states, and folk beliefs about the boundaries of life. Things that had once existed as quiet unease were now brought onto the table of reason. In this process, knowledge became a tool for arrangement. Disparate stories were placed side by side. Conflicting beliefs were compared. Hypotheses were set against one another, not to arrive at the absolute truth, but to create a mental map where everything held a relative position. With a map being lost becomes less frightening. The underlying tension lay in the fact that knowledge never fully calms what it touches. Each answer opens onto further questions. Each explanatory system exposes its own limits. Bram Stoker came to see that understanding does not mean complete control, yet he also knew that not understanding was worse. For him, the library was a place where what could not be controlled was transformed into something that could be thought about. Uncertainty did not disappear, but it was kept within sight. Once seen directly, it was less capable of surprise. And for someone who had once lived through prolonged waiting, minimizing surprise remained a priority. In the quiet of long hours spent reading, Bram Stoker did not seek emotional release. He sought structure. How different cultures explain the same phenomena. How different eras responded to the same fears. Knowledge in this context was not the accumulation of facts, but the comparison of behavioral patterns. The more he read, the more he realized that what once felt personal was largely collective. Fear response ritual all carried histories. They repeated with minor variations, yet their basic structure endured. This recognition offered reassurance, but it also stirred a new unease. If everything had happened before, had humanity truly learned anything from it? Knowledge did not merely arrange the vague, it revealed its prevalence. What Bram Stoker had once felt as a private experience was gradually placed within a broader context. This reduced isolation, but highlighted another truth, that humans in their effort to control fear often create systems of thought capable of existing independently of individuals. Through this process, research became a self-reinforcing habit. Each time a troubling question surfaced, the reflex was to seek more information, not to resolve it completely, but to keep it within manageable bounds. Knowledge in this way was both a tool and a barrier. The quiet tension lay in Bram Stoker's growing awareness that arranging the vague did not make it vanish. It only changed the form in which it existed. From formless anxiety, it became concepts, models, and objects of study. Yet this transformation could also grant new power to what was studied. When something is understood too thoroughly, it tends to lose its original ambiguity, but gains the ability to be recreated. Ideas that are systematized travel more easily than fears left unnamed. And at that moment, a question began to take shape not loudly, but persistently. When we try to understand everything, are we calming it, or are we quietly amplifying its capacity to exist in another form? When research continues long enough, it often leads to a different kind of movement. It is no longer reading in order to understand, but reading in order to arrange. Bram Stoker gradually moved away from passive reception and into a more deliberate act of selection. He was not seeking inspiration in the conventional sense. He was looking for pieces that could be placed beside one another. What he engaged with did not belong to a single field. Folklore appeared alongside fragmented historical records. Folk rituals were set next to early medical observations. Ancient beliefs about the dead returning were compared with scientific hypotheses struggling to explain unclear physiological states. There was no rigid boundary between what was labeled superstition and what was considered knowledge. Everything was taken in as data. What is striking is that Bram Stoker did not attempt to create anything new from these materials. He did not add details that had never existed. He did not try to surpass them through imagination. Instead, he selected. He retained elements that could stand together without direct contradiction. What did not fit the structure, taking shape, was set aside, not because it was false, but because it was unnecessary. This act of selection was cold and precise. It was not driven by emotion or by a desire to impress. It resembled the way a manager reorganizes a workflow more than the way an artist searches for personal expression. Each piece kept had to serve a function. It needed to clarify a pattern, a logical line of understanding that could be followed from beginnings to end. In folklore, Bram Stoker found recurring images, stories of the restless dead. Rituals were performed to ensure that death was final. Acts that appeared extreme yet were considered necessary within their context. He did not judge these stories by modern standards. He viewed them as reasonable responses to forces beyond human control. Placed side by side, rituals began to reveal a shared structure. They did not emerge randomly. They followed a logic of prevention. When certainty was lacking, people did more than seemed necessary. When confirmation was impossible, they chose to eliminate risk through action. These rituals were not meant to glorify death, but to control it, or at least to control fear of it. Alongside this, early scientific records provided a different language. They attempted to name phenomena that folklore had long responded to: states of coma, delayed recovery, unexpected reflexes. Science was not yet capable of delivering definitive conclusions, but it offered a framework for thought. And in its incompleteness, it stood beside ancient belief rather than in opposition to it. Bram Stoker did not treat science as a replacement for folklore. He treated it as another layer, adding to what already existed. When placing these sources together, he did not seek contradiction to discard one side. He looked for points of intersection where different explanations were attempting to answer the same question. The question remained unchanged. Only the language differed. This process of gathering scattered pieces unfolded slowly. There was no moment of revelation, no shocking discovery. Only the steady accumulation of compatible elements. Each piece retained little significance on its own, but when positioned correctly, they began to form a whole with a clear shape. What matters is that this whole was not created from nothing. It was the result of choice. What was kept shaped, what could be seen. What was omitted, vanished from the picture. Bram Stoker understood that he was not inventing, but he also understood that selection is never entirely neutral. When someone selects data, they do not merely reflect reality. They shape how reality is presented. The gathered pieces begin to tell a story of their own, not because they were embellished, but because they were arranged in a particular order. And that order bears the imprint of the one who arranged it, whether they are conscious of it or not. Throughout this process, Bram Stoker maintained distance from the idea of creation. He did not see himself as an inventor. He was a connector. Yet, connection, when tight enough, can create the illusion of something new, not because the elements are new, but because their proximity has not existed before. The dominant feeling in this stage was not excitement, but the cold satisfaction of consistency. Everything began to align. The pieces no longer felt loose. They supported one another, reinforced one another. And in that reinforcement, a structure gradually took shape, solid enough to stand on its own. But it is here that a problem begins to surface. Once the pieces have been selected and arranged, they are no longer neutral data. They become a system, and a system, even when built from existing material, carries the power to guide how people understand the world. The question is not whether Bram Stoker created anything. The question is what selection truly does. Are we reflecting reality as it is, or are we constructing a version of reality coherent enough to be trusted and therefore strong enough to outlast the very fragments from which it was assembled? There is a moment in every process of arrangement when ambiguity is no longer allowed to exist as it once did. When the pieces have been gathered, when the structure is clear enough to stand on its own, the need to name emerges, not as decoration but as a final step to confirm that what exists is no longer merely a collection of separate elements. For Bram Stoker, that moment did not arrive with emotion. It was not marked by discovery or excitement. It unfolded with the calm of someone accustomed to completing systems. Once everything had been arranged, naming was no longer an open question, but a technical requirement. An entity to be handled must be named. Before that, what he faced still existed in a gray zone. Phenomena are described in multiple ways, beliefs expressed through different languages, rituals with similar purposes but different forms. They all pointed towards something, yet that something had no clear point of convergence. It was a set of signs, not yet an entity. Language in this state functioned as a frame. When a name was assigned, elements began to gather around it. Details that had been scattered found their place. Minor contradictions softened, not because they disappeared, but because they were no longer prioritized. The name did not explain everything, but it created a center around which everything could turn. Naming does not transform ambiguity into truth, but it turns ambiguity into something that can be spoken of without starting from the beginning each time. Once a name is accepted, it carries an unspoken assumption that those who use it agree on a shared range of meaning. It need not be exact. It only needs to be sufficient for communication to continue. Bram Stoker understood this early through administrative and managerial work. A process without a clear name is always interpreted differently. A role without precise designation remains contested. Names do not merely distinguish, they stabilize, and when applied to the most ambiguous things, they produce a powerful sense of control. When a name is given to something that previously existed, only a sensation reflects, or fear, it begins to take shape, not physical shape, but conceptual form. It can be mentioned, recorded, and transmitted. It no longer depends entirely on the original context that produced it. It can move across spaces and times. Language here is not simply descriptive. It is an act. In naming, people do not merely identify. They affirm existence. Something that is named is harder to deny than something only implied. It steps out of uncertainty and moves closer to being accepted as part of reality. The faint unease does not come from the content of the name, but from its consequences. Once an entity has a name, it begins to acquire a history. Earlier stories are rearranged to fit the new designation. Rituals are reinterpreted as responses to it. Fears are explained as signs of its presence. What was once scattered now has a point of convergence. This does not happen dramatically. It resembles a slow shift in the center of gravity. At first, the name is used merely as a convenient label. Over time, it gathers weight. It is repeated more often, recorded more carefully, and passed on with less explanation. And when explanation is no longer required, existence has been silently acknowledged. Bram Stoker did not name it with the intention of creating a creature. He was named to complete a structure of thought. Yet that completion produced something new, not through imagination, but through consistency. When elements are bound tightly enough, the whole begins to exist independently. It no longer requires the arranger to persist within the minds of others. A name allows an entity to be invoked even when its original context has disappeared. It makes presence mobile. It can be carried, repeated, and recreated. And in that process, the name begins to live a life of its own, no longer entirely dependent on the initial purpose of the one who assigned it. Language intended to clarify here introduces a new form of unease. While things remain vague, they struggle to take root. Once named, they gain footing. They can be believed, feared, transmitted. And that belief no longer requires constant verification. It is reinforced through repeated use. At this stage, Bram Stoker did not grasp the full consequences of naming. To him, it was simply the next logical step in arranging. But language does not stop at the user's intention. Once released, it carries the power to shape perception in others in ways that cannot be fully predicted. And here, another boundary is crossed quietly and without warning. When something is named long enough, often enough, it no longer needs proof to exist. It exists because it has been named. And there are things that once named only truly begin to live from that moment onward. Once something has been named, the next step is almost unavoidable, deciding how to deal with it. An entity, whether it exists in thought or in collective memory, cannot remain indefinitely in a state of ambiguity. Ambiguity generates unease, and unease always drives people towards structure. For Bram Stoker, this moment was not dramatic. It unfolded as a familiar reflex of someone accustomed to living among systems and order. Folktales, when they stand alone, can be retold in many versions. They are flexible, changing by region, by storyteller, by circumstance. But once they are placed beside one another and tied to a shared name, they begin to demand consistency, not because they naturally become identical, but because people cannot endure prolonged uncertainty. To cope, they standardize. Standardization begins with small details. Which signs indicate the presence of the entity? Which behaviors count as evidence? Which responses are appropriate? What was once passed down orally in many variations is now reorganized into lists, not to make it more accurate, but to make it more usable. In this process, rules emerge, not as moral commands, but as practical guidance. If this sign appears, do that. If there is doubt, act according to what has already been validated. These rules provide a sense of control. They transform fear from a diffuse emotion into a problem that can be handled. Methods of destruction, or more precisely, methods of eliminating the threat, are placed within the same logic. Actions once considered ritual become measures. They are described in neutral language, closer to technique than belief. When an action is framed as a necessary step within a procedure, it loses some of its perceived violence. It becomes simply something that must be done. Bram Stoker did not invent these rules from nothing. He gathered them from what already existed, but by placing them together, removing obvious contradictions, and preserving shared elements, he turned them into a system. And a system once formed no longer operates according to the logic of individual fragments. It begins to operate according to its own logic. In this process, folklore gradually loses the ambiguity that once defined it. The gaps that allowed storytellers to interpret are narrowed. Flexibility gives way to consistency. What was once seen as the adaptive strength of folk culture is now treated as imprecision in need of correction. When a system becomes sufficiently standardized, it begins to resemble reliable knowledge. People no longer need to believe each story. They believe in the system that has synthesized those stories. This trust does not rest on absolute proof, but on the sense that all possibilities have been accounted for. And in that sense, in moments of unease, is deeply persuasive. What is troubling is that once everything has rules, doubt becomes unnecessary. Not because doubt has been resolved, but because it is treated as an obstacle. The system does not require users to understand deeply. It only requires them to follow. When rules are already in place, questioning can appear dangerous because it slows the response. In such an environment, personal responsibility continues to fade. No one needs to ask whether their action is right. The question has already been answered within the structure of the system. Following the rules becomes equivalent to doing what is right, and when right is defined, this way error can only arise from disobedience. Bram Stoker, with long experience in maintaining administrative structures, understood the power of standardization. He knew that a well-functioning system does not need constant explanation. It only needs to be used. And once used long enough, it becomes self-evident. No one remembers why the rules were created. They simply exist. The unease of this stage does not come from the content of the rules, but from the way they replace ambiguity with assumed certainty. When folklore remained ambiguous, it forced people to weigh options, to interpret, to bear responsibility for their choices. Once systematized responsibility is transferred to the structure, people act within a framework and no longer face fear directly. A standardized system creates the impression that every situation has already been anticipated, yet that very impression is the source of deeper unease. No system can encompass all of reality. What lies outside the rules will either be ignored or worse, forced to conform to the rules at any cost. At this point, Bram Stoker was no longer observing the system from outside. He was part of it, not as a manipulator, but as someone who believed order was necessary. But when order is applied to what is inherently ambiguous, it not only clarifies, it hardens what should remain flexible. And within that hardening, a quiet question takes shape. It is not asked directly, but it is present in every rule. When everything has laws, when every response has been standardized, do people still need doubt? Or has doubt itself, once essential for navigating chaos, become something with no place in a system that is too complete? A system once sufficiently complete seeks to leave the private space in which it was formed. It no longer depends on the constant presence of the one who arranged it. It can be carried, repeated, and applied in other contexts. And at that moment, control begins to shift. Publication does not arrive as a deliberate act of release. It feels like the next logical step in a sequence already set in motion. When a structure is coherent enough, bringing it outward is no longer a question of whether, but of when. What has been written, recorded, and standardized can now be read by those who did not take part in its formation. The stage, the press, and the public introduce an entirely different space. Their details are no longer absorbed in the quiet of study. They are placed into a faster rhythm, where attention is limited and meaning must be grasped immediately. What was built with care begins to be simplified, emphasized, or discarded, depending on what others find necessary. Bram Stoker cannot control how his work is received. Once it leaves the desk, it enters a new life cycle. Readers bring their own experiences, fears, and expectations. They do not approach the structure as a system arranged for understanding, but as a story meant to be felt. And in the act of feeling, meaning begins to shift. Elements once placed together for consistency are now linked for their evocative power. Details, meant to clarify structure, become emotional focal points. The public does not engage with the entire system. They select what resonates most strongly. And when those parts are repeated often enough, they begin to stand in for the whole, even though they are only fragments of it. The stage amplifies this process. What is performed must be clear, recognizable, and memorable. Ambiguity is retained not for reflection, but for stimulation. Gaps in the original system are filled with interpretation, imagery, and collective emotion. Each performance becomes an adjustment, a recreation. In public space, meaning is no longer protected by original intent. It is continually negotiated between teller and listener. Bram Stoker can recognize familiar elements, but the way they are connected is no longer in his hands. What was once arranged as a response to uncertainty now becomes a source of new uncertainties. The moment of losing control does not arrive as a shock. It comes as a gradual realization that the work has begun to operate without its author. Questions are no longer directed toward the one who arranged the system, but toward the system itself as an independent entity. People ask what it says, what it represents, what it reflects within them. Bram Stoker is not erased from the story immediately. His name remains attached to the work, but his role changes. He is no longer the arbiter of meaning, but a historical reference point. Meaning is recreated with each reading, each performance, each retelling. And with each recreation, the distance between intention and consequence widens. There is a subtle slide, almost imperceptible, between creating a structure and watching that structure be used for different purposes. No one is deliberately distorting it. Each person simply reads in their own way, performs in their own way, and retells in a way that fits their context. Yet it is precisely that fit which allows the work to escape its original frame. When an idea enters public life, it must adapt to survive. What is not repeated fades away. What provokes a response is preserved. Gradually, the work ceases to be the sum of its initial choices and becomes the result of countless secondary ones. And those choices do not belong to the author. Bram Stoker can recognize that losing control is not failure. It is the inevitable outcome of releasing a structure from private space. But inevitability does not make the experience comfortable. When an idea leaves you and begins to live another life, your relationship to it changes. You can no longer intervene. You can only observe. In the role of observer, he stands between two states. On one side, he recognizes that the work has moved beyond the personal. On the other hand, he confronts the fact that its consequences are no longer within reach. Meaning no longer requires his consent in order to continue spreading. The sensation of slipping away does not come from loss of recognition or ownership. It comes from realizing that a structure created to understand the world is now participating in shaping how the world understands itself. And when that shaping occurs beyond original intention, the question becomes more complex. Once an idea has left you, once it is used, interpreted, and recreated by others, to what extent are you still responsible? Or has responsibility, like control, slipped away with it, leaving you standing at the point of origin, watching something you once arranged continue forward without needing you any longer? When an idea has remained apart from its creator long enough, a subtle shift begins to occur. It is no longer approached as a product with a specific history of formation, but as something that seems to have always existed. Questions of origin gradually lose their urgency. What remains is not the process, but the final shape the idea carries as it enters collective life. Dracula entered that stage quietly, without declaration, without confirmation. It appeared in places where the original context was no longer mentioned. People recognized it without needing to know where it came from. Elements once bound to history, to research, to an initial system of thought were slowly set aside. What remained was a symbol that could be used immediately. A symbol does not demand deep understanding. It functions through recognition. A few signs are enough to trigger a response. In this case, those signs had been refined through countless repetitions. They no longer explained. They evoked. There was no need to recount the full story. A name, a familiar image, was enough for meaning to surface on its own. When a symbol reaches that point, it no longer requires its original context to exist. It can be placed into entirely different environments, different times, and different cultures, and still retain its capacity to act. This flexibility allows it to outlive any single story that once produced it. Bram Stoker, in this process, gradually receded from the center. His name was not erased, but it was no longer essential. The symbol did not need its creator in order to continue being used. It did not need the original intention in order to be understood. It required only familiarity and the ability to be recreated within the imagination of others. This did not happen because people deliberately forgot the origin. It happened because the symbol functioned more efficiently when unbound. When it no longer had to explain why it existed, it could exist anywhere. It became a cognitive tool, a frame into which people placed their own fears, anxieties, and unanswered questions. In this process, Dracula ceased to represent a specific system of thought. It became an empty image, broad enough to hold many interpretations. Each generation could see within it what they needed to see. Each context could use it to speak about its own unease. The symbol did not wear down through repeated use. It was renewed through reinterpretation. The chill does not come from the symbol's content, but from its adaptability. Something that can persist without remembrance of why it first appeared carries an unsettling power. It reveals that meaning is not fixed. It can detach from cause, from responsibility, from context. When a symbol no longer needs an origin, it no longer needs supervision. No one remains in a position to say this is not what it was meant to signify. Every interpretation finds space, as long as it is accepted widely enough. In that space, the symbol becomes autonomous. It exists because it is used, not because it remains faithful to any original intention. Bram Stoker, if he is mentioned at all, becomes a marginal detail, a name attached to a moment that has passed. The symbol does not belong to that moment. It is separated like a living organism that no longer requires its original environment to survive. It adapts, transforms, and continues to spread. What is unsettling is not that a symbol becomes popular. It is that it becomes too familiar. When people no longer question it, no longer wonder where it came from, no longer feel the need to understand it fully. At that point, the symbol begins to operate as a reflex. It is used before it is thought about. In this state, Dracula is no longer a story to be told. It is a template to be filled, a quick way to speak about the other. the threatening, the thing that does not belong to ordinary order. And because it is so flexible, it can be used for many purposes, not all of them harmless. The chill arrives with the realization that such a symbol does not require its creator to continue existing, nor does it require constant verification. It survives through its ability to be reborn in each new context. And with each rebirth, it carries new meanings, new consequences. At this point, the question is no longer whether the symbol itself is evil. The question is whether its capacity for rebirth has any limit. When an image can live indefinitely by changing form, when it can be used without remembering why it first came into being, what is truly more frightening evil itself, or its ability to continually find new shapes through which to persist? There is a distance that is difficult to perceive between the moment a person ends and the moment what they leave behind begins to reveal its full consequences. That distance is not measured in specific years, but in the degree of separation between the creator and what has been created. For Bram Stoker, that distance opened immediately after his life closed. His death did not carry the feeling of a final chapter marked by resonance. There was no major event to signal his departure, no widespread recognition that something significant had just ended. He left the world, much as he had lived most of his life, quietly, without disruption, without holding the public's attention for long. At that time, Dracula already existed, but it had not yet taken the shape of a complete legacy. It remained tied to particular contexts, unstable interpretations, and experiments still forming. The later variations, the layers of meaning built upon one another, the uses far beyond original intention had not yet fully emerged. Bram Stoker did not witness the moment when the symbol detached itself entirely from its own history. His passing did not interrupt the life cycle of the work. No gap needed to be filled. Adaptations continued to be staged, retold, adjusted. Those who came afterward did not require his presence to sustain the process, and within that uninterrupted continuation, the role of the creator gradually faded. There is an irony in the way legacies function. They rarely reach their fullest state while the creator is still alive. As a human life ends, the structures left behind begin to expand. Long-term consequences, unforeseen interpretations, and impacts beyond the original scope only truly surface when no one remains at the center to guide them. Bram Stoker was no longer there to respond. He could not agree with or resist the ways his work was being used. He could not revise, explain, or impose limits. Questions of responsibility, intention, and consequence continued to be asked, but the one person who could answer from the point of origin was absent. The quiet, hollow feeling does not come from the loss of a particular individual, but from the realization that a process has ended at the human level while continuing at the level of ideas. When a human life concludes, what they have created does not conclude with it. On the contrary, it often enters a phase of greater activity, greater freedom, and fewer constraints. At this point, responsibility becomes a vague concept. The creator is gone. Those who receive the work do not carry original responsibility. Consequences produced through repeated use of the symbol cannot be easily traced to a single source. They exist as the result of a long collective sequence extending across time without a clear endpoint. The emptiness also arises from recognizing that Bram Stoker did not see the full path his work would take. He did not witness how it would be reborn, exploited, and placed into contexts he had never imagined. This is not an injustice in an emotional sense, but a cold reality of how legacies operate. There were questions he did not have time to ask, or if he did consider them, he had no opportunity to witness their answers. Questions about whether systematizing fear makes it stronger, whether naming and standardizing create an independent entity, or merely reflect what already exists. Those questions continue to be asked after his death, but they are no longer directed toward him. In the absence of its creator, the work becomes more autonomous than ever. It requires no protection, no explanation from its origin. It exists within cultural flow, used, transformed, and transmitted by people with no personal connection to the moment of its creation. This grants it longevity, but also removes it from any possibility of control. The emptiness does not come from death itself, but from the distance between death and continuation. When a person is gone, what they leave behind does not pause to wait for them. It moves on, and in moving on, it can travel far beyond what was ever anticipated. Bram Stoker closed his life before seeing the full shape of the legacy he helped create. He did not witness the extent to which the symbol would permeate cultural life. He did not see the variations, the rebirths, the uses far removed from any original context. And it is precisely this absence of witnessing that clarifies an unsettling truth. Some consequences do not appear within the span of a human life. They required a space created by absence to grow. They require the ending of one life to begin their own trajectory, no longer bound by intention, responsibility, or initial limits. And once they begin, there is no one left who can claim or refuse the role of having started them. When enough time passes after the death of a creator, a clear separation begins to appear, not between right and wrong, and not between truth and falsehood, but between what is visible and what truly continues to exist. In this case, what endures is not the specific image of Dracula, but the way people learn to think about evil through that image. Dracula as a character can change endlessly. Its appearance is renewed, its settings is adjusted, its personality is reinterpreted to suit each era. Yet beneath those variations, something remains constant. A quiet cognitive pattern is preserved and continues to be used even when the original name and form are no longer mentioned. That pattern does not speak about a particular creature. It speaks about how humans define evil as something that comes from outside, something that does not belong to the familiar order. Another not fully human or no longer regarded as human in the proper sense. Once this pattern is established, it gives fear a clear shape and a specific target toward which it can be directed. What is unsettling is that this pattern does not require Dracula to exist. It can attach itself to any image that fits the role, a foreign figure, a group labeled as different, something that cannot be immediately explained. Once the pattern is ready, finding something to place within it becomes only a matter of timing and circumstance. Bram Stoker, in arranging fragments of folklore and knowledge, did not create this pattern from nothing. He merely helped make it clearer, more recognizable, and more easily transmitted. But once clarified, the pattern no longer needs the original story to keep functioning. It exists as a cognitive tool ready to be activated whenever society encounters new unease. The chilling realization does not come from noticing that Dracula is still mentioned. It comes from recognizing that even if Dracula disappeared, the pattern of thought it represents would continue to live. People still need an image into which they can place their fear. They still need a boundary to distinguish what is normal from what must be excluded, and this pattern provides that boundary efficiently. When a pattern is used long enough, it becomes reflexive. There is no need to retell the original story, no need to explain its origin. It is enough to suggest that a threat exists outside familiar order, and collective response activates automatically. Rules standardized long ago are called into action. Measures once justified under uncertainty are again considered necessary. In this state, evil does not need to be proven. It only needs to be recognized according to the familiar pattern. And once recognized, action against it appears self-evident. Doubt has no role. Questioning can be seen as dangerous because it slows a response that has already been programmed. What truly lives is not an immortal creature, but a way of thinking capable of reproducing itself. It adapts to new language, new contexts, new fears. It is not limited by any specific form. It needs only to be fed by the sense that something does not belong to us, and therefore must be controlled or eliminated. This pattern survives through its convenience. It allows people to simplify complex problems. Instead of confronting deep causes, internal contradictions, or collective responsibility, attention can be directed toward an external object, an image clear enough to carry fear and distant enough not to threaten one's sense of self. Through this convenience, the pattern continues to circulate, sometimes under different names and images, but its function remains unchanged. It continues to shape how people understand threat, evil, and difference. And because it is not tightly bound to a single story, it is harder to challenge. The chill of recognition appears when one realizes that this pattern does not require the continued existence of a monster to function. It can sustain itself, reproduce itself, and find new targets. Meanwhile, specific stories may fade, be forgotten, or be replaced. At this stage, Dracula remains only a prominent example, but the example is not the core. The core is the pattern that has been established and continues to operate. It lives in how people respond to fear, in how they classify the world, and in how they legitimize their actions when faced with unease. When looking at this true legacy, the question is no longer whether Dracula still exists. The question becomes deeper and more disturbing. If the pattern of thought about evil and the other remains alive, still in use, still activated whenever a target is needed for fear, does the specific monster need to exist at all? Or is that pattern itself the thing that has achieved a form of immortality beyond human control? When all layers of interpretation are stripped away, when the symbol has detached from its origin, when the pattern is recognized as the thing that truly endures, what remains is a human being, not a monster, not an idea, not a system. Just Bram Stoker before anything slipped beyond his control. He did not begin as someone seeking to spread fear. He did not live as a man obsessed with evil. Most of his life unfolded in familiar spaces, shaped by concrete jobs and clearly defined responsibilities. He believed in order, in documentation, in humanity's ability to arrange the world into something more livable. Nothing in those choices suggested an underlying threat. Bram Stoker was ordinary in the deepest sense of the word. He carried inherited memories from his community. He learned how to exist within stillness. He recovered and chose stability. He observed power without holding it. He worked to keep things running smoothly. He studied to understand selected in order to clarify and named in order to organize. No step in that sequence appears unusual when viewed on its own. It is precisely that ordinariness that makes the entire story unsettling. There is no single moment that can be pointed to as an obvious mistake. No decision bears the mark of recklessness. Each step made sense within its context. Each choice could be justified as an attempt to control uncertainty, minimize risk, or create order. Looking back, it is tempting to search for hidden intentions or deeper motives, but doing so misses what matters most. The unsettling element is not that Bram Stoker did something extraordinary, it is that he did things that were familiar, acceptable, and very much like what many others would have done in the same circumstances. He did not create evil. He did not invent fear. He merely helped make what already existed clearer, more structured, and easier to recognize. And once these things are clarified, standardized, and named, they gain the ability to slip free from the hands of the one who arranged them and continue on their own. Returning to the human origin offers no comfort. It does not allow for an easy conclusion that everything went wrong because of one exceptional individual. Instead, it forces a confrontation with the possibility that large consequences can grow out of very ordinary actions carried out with good intentions, or at least without malice. A long silence emerges here, not because there is nothing to say, but because there is too much that resists being easily put into words. When symbols and patterns are peeled away, what remains is not a monster, but a person uncomfortably similar to ourselves. A person who believed that understanding and organizing the world was a good thing. A person who believed order was necessary. A person who did not foresee that structures created to soothe fear might also become tools that allow fear to endure. In that silence, the story no longer belongs to Bram Stoker. It turns back toward the listener, toward everyday choices deemed reasonable, toward systems built to reduce uncertainty, toward names assigned to make ambiguity manageable, toward patterns used to categorize the world quickly and efficiently. There is no closed conclusion, no neatly packaged lesson, only a lingering reflection that asks each person to examine their own role in similar processes. The moments when they choose order over doubt, the moments when they accept patterns because they are convenient, the moments when they believe that organizing is harmless. Bram Stoker, above all, was not a mystical figure. He was a human being living in his time, using the tools his era provided, and carrying the same anxieties shared by people in every age. Seeing him as an exception only makes the story feel safer than it truly is. This story does not end with the image of an immortal monster, but with the image of an ordinary person standing at the point of origin, unaware of what will follow. And in that prolonged silence, only one question remains, one that does not look backward, but directly at the present. If you were in his position, with the same memories, the same fears, the same need for order, and the same tools to understand the world, would you have done anything differently?